Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School in collaboration with Bloomberg Law. I'm your host, Jen Leonard. For this episode, we'll be talking about what the rollback of online privacy protections by the government means for consumers and businesses. To take us through this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Christopher Yu, the John H. Chestnut Professor of Law, Communication, and Computer and Information Science here at Penn. He's also the Director of the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition here at Penn Law. Also joining us from Arlington, Virginia is Kyle Daly, who covers data security, digital privacy, and telecom policy for Bloomberg Law. Thank you for joining us. My first question is for Kyle. Kyle, to establish context, what online privacy regulations did the government strike down and why?
So the FCC, under the Obama administration last year, established these new broadband privacy rules. And they did a few things, but primarily they just said that your ISP, so whoever you get your internet service from, whether that's Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, because it applied to mobile and wired broadband, that they have to get your permission before they can collect and use for marketing or advertising certain information about you. So that would be some of your account information, who you are, your location, but also stuff like your browsing habits. So your history of websites that you go to, also your geolocation. So particular for mobile use, where you are when you have your phone on you. And other sensitive data, stuff like financial information, but just that they have to get your permission first before they can collect and use any of that. And so those were all wiped away. So right now there are no specific rules on the books protecting that information.
So Christopher, could you please describe for us some of the legal battles that occurred during the Obama administration and what specifically was at stake?
So it's really interesting. I mean, I think Kyle's laid out the basic situation pretty clearly. It's funny, when you read the media reports, people seem to suggest that, some important protections have been taken away. I think Kyle pointed out these were rules that were adopted in the 11th hour of the Obama administration, actually just never went into effect. So in fact, we've had the status quo all along and nothing's really changed. What's interesting is all this is the aftermath of the political battles around the open internet order, what's sometimes called network neutrality. Originally, Tom Wheeler, the chairman of the FCC under the Obama administration, proposed something fairly moderate along the lines with what he said was following the roadmap the courts had laid out for him to move forward. President Obama made a speech following the midterm elections in November 2014 that called for a much more extensive intervention. Tom Wheeler initially said, I don't want to do that. The FCC is an independent agency, was going a different direction, but eventually was overcome by politics and became wrapped up in a major reclassification where we changed a basic decision we'd never made before. Unlike every other country in the world, we've never regulated the internet the way we regulated the traditional telephone systems. The same sort of regulations developed 100 years ago for a different system, and that gave us more flexibility. In this case, we folded the internet into that system, but selectively chose not to enforce certain rules. And it became very, very heavily politicized, more submissions than any previous hearing, any matter before the FCC was submitted by the public. And you see a lot of sturm and drang about it, but the reality is, I think, frankly, not that much has changed. The one thing is right now is the FTC, following that ruling, doesn't have jurisdiction over it, and instead they're governed by the FCC. The FCC has certain rules, but again, developed for the telephone network. They're a bit of an odd fit, but actually the chairman is going to, apparently within the next 2 weeks, announce a major decision rolling back the open internet order, which would restore FTC jurisdiction.
So Kyle, are lawmakers divided along partisan lines on protecting consumers' privacy, or is it more of a nuanced issue?
So it generally has been fairly partisan, but what we have seen is that there is a bit of a break. When this resolution was voted on in the House, there were 15 Republicans who broke with the party and ended up voting not to pass the resolution. So it wasn't enough to swing the vote, but there was sort of this miniature block of moderate and more libertarian-leaning Republicans who were opposed to this rollback. And I've spoken to some people in the public interest community, some of those same folks that Christopher was alluding to who mobilized a lot of the comments in the original net neutrality proceeding. And they seem to think that, people didn't really become terribly aware of this in the general public until it happened. And they seem to be of a mind that if they'd had another week or two to kind of get the word out there, that there may have been more Republicans to come over to the side of the Democrats on this.
So the political partisan dynamics around communications policy are markedly different in the last 5 to 10 years. Traditionally, there's been a fair amount of consensus and overlap, and people, both sides have worked together, both in Congress and in the FCC. What you've seen really since probably 2007 is an increasing partisan polarization of these issues, which I think is unfortunate. What's fascinating to me is the FCC has stepped in here, was struck down by the courts once, stepped in again, was upheld by the courts, and it's pretty clear that the best idea is a legislative solution, so it's not really up to the agency anymore. You have something firmly set by the elected representatives of the American people. The compromise legislation they're moving towards is a proposal advanced by Henry Waxman, and now the Republicans are looking to what was originally a Democratic proposal as the possible blueprint for moving forward.
Thank you, Christopher. So could you tell us what this means for businesses?
I actually think that the regime, had it been allowed to stay in place, that treated the network providers different from the website operators, that is the Googles and the Netflixes and the Facebooks, would have been a really difficult world. So one of the things that's fascinating is Verizon has bought Yahoo and is becoming increasingly involved in content. In addition, AT&T is in the process of trying to acquire Time Warner and all the content industries. And Google has this wonderful, they've done with Google Fiber, they're both a network provider, but they provide higher level services. And if you had two different regulatory regimes governing two different parts of the network, a company would have to figure out, okay, when I'm providing a service, at what point does this stop being FCC land and start becoming under the jurisdiction of the Federal Trade Commission? And then you have to read these rules with very subtle differences in the language to try to figure out exactly what they mean. Historically, we've taken what's called a technologically neutral position to privacy regulation. We wanted one regime that applied equally so that everyone would have a good set of rules, they could understand them, but also so companies wouldn't have to design around or have to take into consideration things that weren't about the technology and how to deliver great services to consumers. Had we had a dual regime where the FTC runs part of it and the FCC runs part of it, they would have forced companies to really struggle. And I think that having one regime, unified regime, is generally widely recognized as having a lot of merit to it.
Anything to add, Kyle?
Yeah, I think something that is kind of important to note here is that the regime that the FCC established, it was modeled after FTC standards, but it did go further. But the justification offered for that was that your ISP sees more of what you do. They see every website that you go to, whereas Google, you can log out of your account or use DuckDuckGo, which doesn't track your information. There's the idea that ISPs have a more expansive view of your online life. So that was sort of the thinking in expanding the category of sensitive data, of that stuff that they need permission to collect beyond what the FTC has historically done.
And that's actually a source, that is the right question. The interesting, there's a fight going on right now in the technical community. And one of the things that we plan to do is to convene an event in DC, bring together real technological experts to have a debate over this. Many people think that, would agree with the position of the ISP that Kyle, I think, accurately described. Other people think that Google and Facebook see a lot more of our personal information than the ISPs do, particularly in a mobile world where everything's changed quite a bit. So I think this is a great question for an academic institution to look into and to try to get some professors from computer science to really have a very direct discussion about this.
Really interesting. Did you have something else, Kyle?
I was going to say, yeah, that's certainly going to be something that's interesting to watch because, as Christopher's alluded to, and I'm sure we'll get to in a bit more in a bit, the end goal here is to kind of move everything back to the FTC, and there are a few steps that have to be taken before that can happen. But before the election, before the administration's change, even Ajit Pai, the chairman of the FCC now, who is opposed to these rules, he had said, well, the ball's now in the FTC's court. So if they want to raise their standards so that companies like Google and Facebook have to meet that higher FCC standard, maybe that's sort of the conversation. So it'll be interesting to see, obviously this resolution drew a lot of attention, and I'm sure this is an issue, both the privacy piece, but also sort of broader questions about net neutrality that are going to draw a lot of public comment, just as they did the last go around. So, it's possible that at the end of the day, we could end up with sort of a unified regime that's a little closer to what the last FCC did.
So Christopher, for all of us as consumers, where does this leave us now? What are our online privacy protections, and is it enough?
So one of the interesting things about the old regime is there was a certain amount of bureaucratic turf war going on. I think both agencies wanted part of this, and they tried to issue joint communiques about how they're going to cooperate, but they weren't really, because I think the FCC, at that point, there were people who wanted part of the jurisdiction. What you see coming out of the acting chairman of the FTC and the current chairman of the FCC is a much more desire to harmonize and to cooperate. And I think they come to the conclusion, I think, that we should have one good regime that applies to everybody. So what's happening right now, in the interim, with the FCC's rules struck down, but the open internet order in place, right now the FTC has jurisdiction over everything except the networks. The networks are subject to a particular privacy regime set up by the Communications Act of 1934, which is the one that traditionally governs telephone companies. But the chairman of the FCC, Ajit Pai, is apparently working right now on the order that would reclassify network providers so that they can be subject to FTC jurisdiction anymore. And from that point on, we'll go back to the unified regime.
Do you foresee any further deregulation in the space? If so, what do you think is next?
Sure. So, I guess whether one would consider it deregulation is sort of a value judgment, but I am expecting exactly what Christopher was talking about. Sort of in the telecom world, the word on the street is that Ajit Pai is, as Christopher said, actively working on a whole new proceeding that would undo the reclassification of broadband as a common carrier service. So that would then allow the FTC to take back over regulating not just privacy, but also potentially all net neutrality practices. So it would be possibly, from what I'm hearing, the model might be that ISPs would be expected to put net neutrality principles and possibly some privacy principles in their terms of service. And if they do anything to violate that, then the FTC could step in and enforce. Whether that's deregulation, that's sort of an argument for the groups who are interested in this issue to make. But it is, the idea would be moving it over to an agency that doesn't have rulemaking power. So the FTC can't establish these prescriptive rules ahead of time like the FCC can. And also, as we're seeing, at least with privacy, it seems like we're talking about sort of lighter standards to begin with. So it's certainly a trend that I think a lot of critics especially would describe as deregulatory.
Anything to add, Christopher?
So it's a bit more, it's an interesting mix. So what you're seeing right now, one of the new initiatives by the chairman is something called the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, which I was fortunate enough to be nominated to, and I actually was notified earlier that I will be a member of, and the first meeting is on Friday. They're trying to figure out ways to harmonize municipal regulation to make it easier to deploy broadband networks. And their first goal is to set up a model code to sort of smooth out some of these differences. So cities that want to sort of make this easier, and then we've seen with Google Fiber, cities used to think of a broadband company coming in as a chance to get a lot of money. Now they realize they're partners, and that if you make it too hard on the licensing of cell tower siting and the like, you're not going to see it happen. What's fascinating is Verizon has been working with the city of Boston to deploy 5G, which is going to require a radically different architecture. And it's not, I think, too invasive, but they do need a bunch of local regulatory approvals. As of right now, that's proving relatively hard to do. The BDAC is designed to look at those and saying, are there things we can do to make this easier? Some of it actually may look regulatory. I mean, in terms of finding uniform ways to do this and to try to smooth through some of the issues. But it's a little bit more, it's what we're going to find is that the problem of getting the benefits of the internet to all Americans is actually going to require some really creative solutions, some of which will require government actions, and some of them may require the government to pull back a little bit.
So if you were to predict what we can expect to happen in the next few years, what would your prediction be?
So I've learned to be very careful about making predictions because I've been making a lot of them about the last 12 months and most of them have been wrong. And it's interesting, even in the last few weeks, we've seen the administration pull back on a number of commitments it made and look at some different issues. What I think we are going to see is what will be most interesting is some interest in legislative action to actually try to put all of it on a firmer standpoint. I think it's pretty clear we had one answer under the Obama administration. We have another answer that looks like coming out under the Trump administration. The way to end all that is to actually shrine it into federal statutes, into federal law. I think there's a fair amount of enthusiasm in some quarters for doing that. I will say, though, in this environment, passing legislation through Congress is a relatively challenging act. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Anything to add, Kyle?
Just sort of chiming with what Christopher said, I've spoken to lawmakers about this, and that is sort of the end goal. And that's also a message that we've heard from the FCC. The other Republican commissioner, Michael O'Reilly especially, has sort of, repeatedly said, well, we're a creature of Congress, and a lot of these really thorny issues really need to be settled with legislation. So what we're kind of anticipating is that with these and potentially other issues, we'll see the FCC or possibly in some cases the FTC do something. In this case, we're talking about privacy and creating a new net neutrality regime. And then Congress, the idea anyway, would be that Congress would come in and kind of codify that with legislation. And that also gives them a little bit of juice, congressional Republicans, because right now, Democrats have no reason to strike up some compromise on a net neutrality bill because there are strong net neutrality rules on the books from the FCC. So if the FCC comes in and delivers a regime that maybe is a little looser than Democrats are comfortable with, that might bring them to the table. So, while it's kind of hard to predict if any legislation is going to get done on any given issue in sort of the current environment, there might be the right levers here to see Congress do something.
Great. It will be interesting to watch the politics play out. So briefly, for our last word, what can consumers do now to protect our online privacy? Either of you. Christopher, would you like to start?
So I would say that consumers can do quite a bit. A lot of things that seems fairly simple, although it's not so simple. We found out John Podesta still opened up a phishing email, and so there's a lot of basic things. But you have to be careful about the information you send online. You can use HTTPS as a very simple matter, secures a great deal of the internet. Virtual private networks, anonymizers, relying on search engines like DuckDuckGo or by choice where that matters. But I think that it's interesting. We're starting to see companies compete on privacy policies, and they're advertising themselves as privacy friendly. What we're going to see is hopefully, and this is something we've been looking for a long time, is meaningful choice that if consumers would like more privacy protections, they have real options from providers who will give them those greater privacy protections.
Thank you. Anything else, Kyle?
No, yeah, I think Christopher kind of covered it. There's, I think, some dispute as to whether we're quite seeing that competition on privacy yet, at least in the broadband space. But by the same token, ISPs don't really have these big ad networks yet the way that Google or Facebook do. So, perhaps it's something that we will see down the line. But As Christopher said, there are some things that you can do independent of what's out there in the market. HTTPS, as he said, that provides end-to-end encryption so that your ISP, for instance, they could see that you went to a certain website, but they couldn't see what you did on it. Whether that's sort of sufficiently protective of what you're doing, that's sort of a judgment for the user to make. Virtual private networks do mask a lot more of your activity from even your ISP. So that's an option. People who want to stay online but want to really keep their data private, those are options that are out there.
Great. Well, thank you both. We will certainly stay tuned as this continues to evolve. Thank you for joining us today.